The morning sun spilled across the manicured lawns of Hawthorne Court, its pale gold trembling over dew-laden rosebeds and the cold marble of the fountains. A soft wind whispered through the garden's topiaries, bending the clipped hedges in delicate waves, as if the estate itself were sighing in anticipation. In the far corner, beneath a trellis of climbing jasmine, a figure sat alone, Duke Alastair Hawthorne, the last of a proud line, a man whose reputation was as formidable as the walls that enclosed him. Yet in that instant, the Duke's eyes were not the icy steel that so often unsettled visitors. They glistened with a quiet despair, a grief concealed from the world but laid bare beneath the morning light. The night before had been a grand affair, a spring ball attended by the highest echelons of society, each woman draped in silks that gleamed beneath the chandeliers, each man in carefully tailored coats that spoke of fortune and lineage. Elara Whitcomb, a widow of modest means, had dared to attend, accompanied by her young son, Thomas. She moved through the ballroom with the careful grace of one accustomed to restraint, yet each step was shadowed by whispered judgments. Eyes flicked toward her, murmurs threaded through polite conversation, each syllable a subtle condemnation. She dares to appear without the proper connections. Her boy should not be here. It is unseemly. The words were soft, but their sting sharp, each glance a calculated barb. Elara, aware of the scrutiny, held her head high, yet her heart quivered, an invisible tremor that no gown, however fine, could conceal. Thomas, a boy of 7 with chestnut hair that fell in soft waves around his earnest face, sensed the tension. His small hand clung to his mother's, and in his wide eyes was the unspoken question, why do people stare? Why do they frown? Elara offered him only a faint smile, the kind that promised courage even when none could be felt. She whispered for him to be patient, to be quiet, yet the boy's innocence was unarmored against the cruelty of society's gaze. And so, while she maintained the poise expected of her, her inner turmoil simmered, a silent storm beneath the composed exterior. The Duke, in the seclusion of the garden the next morning, was unaware that the boy's heart harbored the seeds of the most unanticipated compassion. Thomas, having risen before dawn, had wandered through the dew-slick paths until he stumbled upon the solitary figure. Alastair's head was bowed, shoulders heavy, as if the weight of lineage, expectation, and private grief pressed upon him with relentless insistence. The boy paused, his small chest rising and falling with curiosity and concern. His gaze, unjaded by etiquette or fear of gossip, settled upon the Duke's bowed form. Innocence, that rare and unarmored lens, allowed him to see the man not as a noble to be feared, but as a soul in need. "Don't cry, sir," Thomas said, voice tentative, yet firm in its simple truth. He stepped closer, the soft grass cushioning each careful footfall. "You can have my mama." The words, so unself-conscious, carried the weight of a child's earnest desire to heal a wound he could not yet understand. Nearby, a maid paused in her sweeping, hand to mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Even the garden seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, the Duke remained still, the sharp lines of his jaw softened by incredulity. The offer, naive as it was, pierced the armor he had so carefully constructed over years of sorrow. Alastair looked up, meeting the boy's wide, trusting eyes. The world, usually so rigid, so demanding of propriety, seemed to falter at the edge of that gaze. He saw in Thomas not merely a child, but a reflection of hope he had long considered lost. And then, as if compelled by a force deeper than reason, his attention shifted to the woman who had followed, hesitantly, along the gravel path. Elara's presence, silent yet unwavering, rendered her suddenly luminous against the gray stone of the garden walls. There was a tremor in the Duke's breath, subtle but undeniable, a recognition of courage and dignity in the woman who had braved the ballroom's censure the night before. Elara's eyes met his, and in that instant, the whispered judgments of society felt both distant and absurd. She had been tried, judged, and found wanting by those who measured worth in lineage and fortune alone. Yet here, in the quiet intimacy of the morning garden, her character required no endorsement. Her spine, straight beneath the soft fabric of her gown, spoke volumes. Alastair saw, without a word, the depth of her endurance, the tenderness she bore for the boy who had so recklessly yet purely offered what was most precious to him. A breeze stirred, sending petals spiraling from the roses above, a visual exclamation that mirrored the sudden, delicate shift in atmosphere. The Duke rose, a motion of deliberation, his boots pressing into the damp earth. His gaze did not waver from Elara, and for the first time in many months, the weight upon his chest lifted, if only slightly. The garden, in its vast and ordered beauty, seemed to pause, attentive to the unspoken dialogue between the woman, the child, and the man who had long confined himself to solitude. The sunlight, falling just so, caught the glint of unshed tears in his eyes, and yet there was no shame in them, only the raw acknowledgment of humanity laid bare. Thomas, sensing a response, allowed a tentative smile to bloom, as if understanding that the world might indeed hold moments of grace even amid judgment. Elara's hand found his once more, firm, protective, yet warm with silent encouragement. The garden's fountains whispered their continuous song, the marble glimmered with dew, and the air carried the scent of jasmine and rose in a way that seemed almost sacred. Within this living frame, the walls of social expectation and fear of scandal began to blur, overtaken by the fragile, nascent connection forming in that luminous morning light. Then, with a quiet authority that had earned him both admiration and fear, Alastair spoke, his voice low yet resonant. "Madam, may I speak to you alone?" The words, simple as they were, carried the gravity of an invitation into a space where the rules of society did not dictate the heart's movement. Elara's pulse quickened, the gravity of his request sinking into her bones. It was a summons she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend, and yet within it lay the promise of something altogether new, a shift, a possibility, a moment poised on the cusp of revelation. Thomas stepped back slightly, understanding, in a child's intuitive way, that his mother would be called into a conversation not meant for him. He nodded, barely audible, as if giving silent consent. The Duke's eyes softened once more, lingering on the boy before turning fully to Elara. The garden, so recently alive with whispers and judgment, now seemed a sanctuary, its blooms and fountains witnesses to a private world untouched by gossip. And yet, the air carried the tension of what was to come, a delicate anticipation, for within that invitation lay both promise and peril. Elara drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the rush of emotions that threatened to betray her composure. She knew that to follow was to step into a space where vulnerability and dignity might collide, where a single misstep could ignite further scandal. Yet, beneath her fear, a spark of hope stirred, hope that in this moment, perhaps, society's rigid walls could be softened by the simple, unassailable truths of heart and character. With one final glance at Thomas, whose expression mixed wonder and pride, she nodded almost imperceptibly and stepped forward, her skirts brushing against the grass, moving toward the Duke whose grief and unexpected humanity had rendered her previous fears almost irrelevant. The garden seemed to exhale with her step, the morning light deepening around the trellis as if nature itself awaited the unfolding of this singular moment. And in the quiet between heartbeats, the world narrowed to the space between them. Two souls, both wounded, both resilient, poised at the edge of an encounter that might shift the course of their lives forever. Alastair's hand, almost imperceptibly, gestured toward a shaded bench beneath the jasmine, a silent invitation. Elara's eyes met his once more, a question and an answer suspended in that gaze, and the air between them vibrated with a tension delicate and electric. The garden, witness to whispers and judgment, now held its breath, as though even the wind and the petals understood that this morning nothing would ever be quite the same. The morning after the garden encounter, Hawthorne Court awoke under a quiet storm of curiosity. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows of the estate, illuminating the polished wood floors and crystal chandeliers that trembled faintly with each passing whisper. Servants moved with careful propriety, but even their measured steps carried the subtle tension of gossip, for the story of a small boy offering his mother to the Duke had spread with astonishing speed. By the time the maids arranged fresh bouquets in the great hall, hushed conversations danced along corridors, winding from the kitchens to the drawing rooms, reaching ears both eager and judgmental. Elara Whitcomb, herself wrapped in the muted elegance of her widow's gowns, walked through the hallways with a grace that belied the weight of scrutiny pressing upon her. Each glance from passing housemaids and governesses was a silent accusation, each whispered conjecture a test of her composure. She felt the sharp sting of curiosity's blade, subtle yet unrelenting, and yet she refused to yield. Her chin lifted, spine straightened, and fingers lightly clasped before her, a small gesture of dignity against the tide of speculation. Thomas, always by her side, sensed her unease and mirrored her careful caution, his youthful heart learning, too early, the precise art of measured steps and quiet obedience. Meanwhile, Duke Alastair remained sequestered in his private chambers, ostensibly occupied with estate business, yet his thoughts lingered on the boy's innocent words and the warmth of Alara's quiet courage. In truth, he had not slept well, for the memory of that morning, the weight of loss, the shock of recognition, the stirrings of something long buried, had stirred him into wakefulness before dawn. The carved wooden horse that he had fashioned himself, an idle pastime during evenings of solitude, now lay on the writing desk beside a folded note. The simplicity of the gesture, a gift for Thomas, carried more meaning than the courtiers could ever understand. Acknowledgment of kindness, a bridge extended from grief to hope. By mid-morning, a messenger arrived at Alara's modest lodgings, his formal tone betraying the importance of the delivery. She unfolded the delicate stationery, finding the small wooden horse within its wrapping, polished and smooth beneath her fingers. Her breath caught as she read the Duke's brief message. "Your son reminded me that kindness still exists in this world." It was a declaration free from scandal yet heavy with personal significance, a ripple of warmth that contrasted with the icy currents of social judgment that pursued her. For a brief moment, Alara allowed herself the quiet luxury of gratitude, brushing a strand of hair from her face and glancing at Thomas, whose eyes gleamed with both wonder and pride. But the world outside was less forgiving. News of the garden incident had metastasized into rumor, the simple truth distorted into insinuations of impropriety. In the salons and parlors of Hawthorne Court, ladies of rank spoke in measured tones, their words laced with venomous delight. The Duke, the poor man, drawn so quickly into sentimentality, one whispered. And that woman, a widow with no claim, daring to occupy such proximity, utterly scandalous. The insinuations grew with each repetition, and Alara, once an observer of social niceties, now found herself unwillingly thrust into the spotlight of speculation. Her dignity, her careful restraint, were tested as never before, yet she refused to falter, though her pulse quickened at each furtive glance. The Duke, aware of the growing murmur of gossip, made a deliberate choice. He summoned Alara to the sewing rooms, a place where domestic activity masked the world's prying eyes. The air was perfumed with the faint scent of lavender and newly starched linens, a subtle sanctuary for a conversation both necessary and delicate. Alara entered, her skirts swishing softly against the polished floor, and curtsied with that perfect balance of formality and inner reserve. Alastair's eyes, usually guarded and commanding, softened as they met hers, and she felt, in the briefest instant, the possibility of mutual understanding. He gestured toward a chair beside a large, sunlit window, its panes catching the morning light and scattering golden reflections across the polished wood. "Madam Whitcomb," he began, his voice tempered yet earnest, "I wish to convey my gratitude for your son's generosity of spirit. In truth, I have seldom encountered such innocence intertwined with courage." His words, measured yet laden with unspoken depth, struck Alara with their sincerity. There was no condescension, no hint of superiority, only acknowledgment, the kind that respects dignity without demanding anything in return. Alara, her heart stirring, responded with a bow of the head, careful, polite, yet suffused with emotion she struggled to conceal. "Your Grace," she murmured, "Thomas is, well, he acts without thought of consequence. I did not expect my son's words to carry such import." Her voice faltered briefly, betraying the collision of pride, fear, and the faintest flicker of hope. Alastair inclined his head, silent for a moment, as if weighing her meaning with care. Outside, the rumors swirled and grew, as they inevitably do. A noblewoman, peering discreetly from the corridor, misinterpreted the scene. The gift, the private conversation, the gentle attentiveness of the Duke, all transformed into a narrative of scandal and favoritism. Yet even as the court's whispers threatened to engulf her, Alara found herself anchored by a quiet realization. The Duke's gestures, the small token, and the unspoken acknowledgment of her son's kindness, all of it suggested a world in which character and heart mattered, even amid the suffocating strictures of society. She had been tested, yet within that trial, a fragile foundation had been laid. Alastair's voice broke the silence once more. "I should hope, madam, that neither the opinions of idle onlookers nor the shadows of rumor prevent you from feeling welcome within these walls. Your presence, and that of your son, is valued." The choice of words, understated yet emphatic, carried the weight of both protection and invitation. For Alara, it was a moment of quiet triumph, the first tangible reassurance that dignity and courage could withstand, and perhaps even transcend, the relentless scrutiny of society. A breeze swept through the open window, carrying with it the scent of the roses outside, as if nature itself endorsed the moment of fragile reconciliation. Thomas, standing a few steps behind his mother, watched with a mixture of pride and curiosity. His gift, accidental in its innocence, had created a bridge where previously there had been only distance and solitude. And yet, the knowledge of the whispers, the gossip that stretched like a shadow across corridors and parlors, remained a constant reminder that society's gaze was both unforgiving and swift. Ilara allowed herself a small, measured smile, one that neither flaunted victory nor admitted fear, but simply acknowledged a truth unspoken yet deeply felt. She knew the court would continue to judge, and that each step forward might bring renewed scrutiny. Yet, for the first time in many weeks, she sensed a possibility beyond the rigid confines of expectation. The Duke's acknowledgment, the carved horse, and the shared understanding between them hinted at a world where the heart's quiet truths might resist rumor and judgment alike. As she prepared to take her leave, Alastair's hand rested briefly upon the edge of the desk, near the wooden horse, a subtle gesture that neither intruded nor demanded, yet conveyed an unspoken invitation. "Walk carefully, Madam Whitcomb," he said, voice low, intimate, yet firmly formal. "And remember that kindness, even when misinterpreted, carries its own authority." Ilara inclined her head, absorbing both the weight and the grace of his words. She turned, feeling the gravity of the whispers pressing at her back, yet carrying forward with a measure of courage she had not yet known she possessed. The garden beyond beckoned, sunlight pooling over paths strewn with petals and dew. Thomas reached for her hand, and she grasped it firmly, a silent pact of protection and shared purpose. And in the hush of that moment, the house itself seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging the fragile, emerging connection between widow, child, and Duke, a connection that rumor could neither fully obscure nor entirely define. The day stretched ahead, uncertain yet charged with possibility, and Ilara felt the weight of choice pressing gently upon her shoulders. To step forward was to embrace both hope and the peril of society's gaze, a risk tempered only by the quiet assurance of the Duke's attentiveness. And in the corridors, behind half-closed doors, eyes lingered, whispers gathered, and a shadow of scandal yet unformed waited, poised to challenge the fragile dignity that had, for one fleeting morning, claimed its quiet victory. The rose garden stretched before them, a private labyrinth of color and scent that seemed impervious to the prying eyes of Hawthorne Court. Sunlight filtered through the branches of ancient yews, dappling the gravel paths with patterns that shifted like liquid gold. The air was warm yet carried a faint chill from the morning, a reminder that spring, though eager, remained cautious. Ilara's skirts whispered against the gravel as she followed Duke Alastair through a secluded archway, the boy Thomas trailing a few steps behind, distracted by a fluttering butterfly. Here, removed from polished floors and gossiping walls, the world narrowed to the gentle rustle of leaves, the murmured song of fountains, and the palpable tension threading the space between them. Alastair's posture, usually rigid with the weight of expectation, softened as he led her along the shaded path. The sunlight caught the angles of his face, revealing the faint traces of sleepless nights etched into his skin. For all his composure, there was an unspoken vulnerability in the tilt of his jaw and the tremor in his hand as he brushed aside a stray branch. He had endured years of mourning in isolation, a duke who commanded respect yet had surrendered his heart to grief. The innocence of Thomas, and the quiet dignity of Ilara, had unsettled a fortress long believed unassailable. Now, in the intimacy of this hidden garden, the walls between them began to shift. Ilara inhaled deeply, the scent of roses and freshly turned earth filling her senses. Her heart, still taut from the scrutiny of the court, began to loosen, yet caution remained. She measured each word, each gesture, aware that the balance between dignity and emotion could tip with the slightest misstep. "Your Grace," she began, her voice a soft chord in the rustling air, "I am grateful for your kindness yesterday. It was unexpected." Her words trembled with a mixture of humility and curiosity, betraying the conflict between social propriety and the pull of something far more intimate. Alastair inclined his head slightly, his eyes, dark and contemplative, tracing the curve of her profile as though memorizing the quiet strength she carried. "Gratitude," he said, voice low and deliberate, "is a fragile thing in a world so quick to misjudge. Yet it is necessary, for even the briefest acknowledgment can alter the course of hearts, should one be willing to observe." He paused, as if weighing the measure of truth in his next words. It is Thomas who has reminded me that the heart, even when burdened, can still recognize kindness. The admission, simple yet profound, caused a flicker of warmth to ignite in Alara's chest. It was rare, almost shocking, to hear sincerity so free from the trappings of social performance. A hush settled between them, filled only by the soft murmur of water from a nearby fountain. The Duke's gaze met hers fully, a careful intensity that asked questions without words. Alara found herself compelled to speak more openly than she had anticipated, her usual reserve dissolving in the shared vulnerability of the moment. "I have been cautious," she admitted, fingers tracing the edge of her gloves. "The world is unforgiving, and a widow like myself is afforded little mercy. I fear, at times, that every act of courage is noted only to be judged harshly." Her confession, tender and unguarded, hung in the fragrant air between them. Alistair's expression softened further, the tension in his shoulders easing as he considered her words. "You speak truth, madam," he said, voice gentle yet resonant. "Society's eyes are sharp, often cruel. And yet, there exists a private world, hidden beneath scrutiny, where honesty may be voiced without consequence. It is here, in the quiet corners, that hearts may speak freely, if one dares to listen." The subtle shift in his tone, the careful cadence of his speech, carried both comfort and invitation. Alara felt the first true stirrings of trust, a rare and delicate bloom in the shadow of relentless expectation. The garden seemed to lean closer, as if nature itself had conspired to create a sanctuary. Birds chirped faintly, their songs weaving around the arches of rose-laden trellises, and the fragrance of jasmine mingled with the scent of wet earth to form a heady, almost intoxicating backdrop. Thomas wandered to the edge of the path, his small hands clasped behind his back, occasionally glancing up with an eager curiosity that reminded both adults of the innocence bridging the chasm between grief and hope. Yet even in this moment of serenity, the world beyond the garden remained poised to intrude, its judgments a distant echo that neither could fully escape. Alistair took a careful step closer, his hand brushing lightly against the railing of the trellis, a gesture both deliberate and restrained. "Madam Whitcomb," he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, "your courage is admirable, and your son's purity has rekindled something long thought extinguished within me. I have been a man of solitude, yet together, you have pierced the armor I have maintained for years." The words, tender and weighted with sincerity, resonated with Alara in a manner she had not anticipated. Her chest rose and fell with a mixture of relief and trepidation, the garden's soft light illuminating the fragile bloom of possibility between them. Alara's hand, previously still, lifted to meet his gaze. I did not intend to influence you, Your Grace. My son speaks without foresight, and yet it seems his innocence has stirred something beyond my comprehension. I am unprepared for the consequences, both spoken and unspoken, that may follow." Her voice, though steady, quivered with the intensity of admission. Alistair's eyes softened further, reflecting not judgment but understanding, a mirror to her own restrained vulnerability. For a long moment, they simply stood, the space between them alive with tension, expectation, and unspoken acknowledgement. The rustle of leaves became a symphony, the murmuring fountain a quiet witness to their shared realization, that grief, kindness, and courage could intertwine to create a connection neither had anticipated, yet both now recognized as undeniable. The garden, with its hidden paths and delicate blossoms, had become a private realm in which truths could be revealed without fear, where the heart might speak softly and be heard. Alistair finally exhaled, a sound barely audible, and inclined his head toward a shaded bench beneath a canopy of roses. "Sit with me, if you will. There is merit in silence as much as in confession. And yet, I sense that words, chosen carefully, might bridge what we have only begun to understand." Alara's fingers trembled ever so slightly as she lowered herself onto the bench, the weight of anticipation pressing delicately upon her chest. Thomas settled nearby, content to watch and listen, oblivious to the deeper currents swirling between the two adults. The Duke's gaze lingered on her, searching, measured, unguarded. "There are truths," he continued, voice low and deliberate, "that one dares not voice in the world, for fear of ridicule or consequence. Yet here, in this corner, away from the gaze of gossip and expectation, perhaps honesty may prevail. Perhaps we may acknowledge what is, without artifice or pretense." Ilara's breath caught, the resonance of his words striking a chord she had not realized was so taut, so fragile. She met his eyes, and for the first time, the weight of societal judgment seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet intensity of two hearts learning to speak in unison. And then, as the sunlight shifted, casting long, trembling shadows across the gravel, Alastair leaned slightly forward, the faintest tremor betraying the gravity of his admission. "I have not spoken freely since the loss I endured. Yet your son and you have reminded me that grief need not be solitary, and that compassion, however unexpected, may awaken that which was long dormant." The words, carefully chosen, resonated like a bell tolling through the still morning, an echo of vulnerability met with courage. Ilara, cheeks warmed by the confession, lowered her gaze briefly, gathering the courage to respond. I have been alone too, Your Grace," she admitted, voice soft but unwavering. "And in our solitude, it is rare to find those who see without judgment. Your acknowledgment, your kindness, is more than I could have anticipated, yet it offers a measure of hope I scarcely believed possible." The pause that followed was filled with the song of the garden, a silence dense with potential and unspoken promises. Alastair's lips curved faintly, a shadow of a smile, and he gestured toward the pathway beyond the roses. "Walk with me," he murmured, "and let us see where this honesty may lead, if only for a few moments." Ilara rose, her pulse quickened, and together they stepped along the gravel, the morning light casting their shadows long and intertwined. And as they moved, the garden seemed to bend around them, a hidden witness to a truth neither rumor nor fear could yet reach, a fragile promise of hearts beginning to find their voice. The evening air was thick with the scent of wisteria climbing the stone walls of Hawthorne Court, the delicate blossoms cascading like lavender waterfalls over the lantern-lit paths. A light drizzle had begun, fine as silk threads, blurring the edges of the gardens and lending a dreamlike quality to the evening. Within the grand hall, the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and polite conversation carried the weight of societal expectation, yet beneath the gaiety simmered the whispers of scandal. News of the Duke's morning meetings with Ilara Whitcomb and her son had reached every attentive ear, twisted into speculation that hardened into judgment before it could even be heard in its true form. Ilara, cloaked in a gown of muted sapphire that complemented the warmth of her eyes, entered the hall with careful poise. Each step was measured, yet every glance from a neighboring lady, every polite nod, carried the subtle sting of scrutiny. She felt the invisible tide of society pressing against her, a weight she had long endured yet never without its toll. The boy, Thomas, clasped her hand tightly, his small fingers trembling slightly, sensing her unease even as he tried to maintain his usual cheer. The Duke, across the hall, observed her arrival with a steady intensity, his dark eyes unwavering despite the murmurs that followed her passage. It was at that moment, amidst the glittering chandeliers and the low murmur of polite society, that the fragile veneer of propriety began to fracture. Alastair moved through the hall with deliberate authority, his presence commanding attention without effort. Conversations faltered mid-sentence as he passed, the Duke's reputation as formidable as the marble pillars that lined the hall. Yet tonight, there was an unfamiliar warmth in his expression, a subtle softening around the edges that none had seen before. When he reached Ilara, the distance between them seemed to collapse, replaced by a gravity that drew eyes and hearts unwillingly toward them. "Madam Whitcomb," he said, voice low yet carrying across the small expanse of space between them, "it has come to my attention that some conjecture has taken root concerning your presence and that of your son within these walls." The words were measured, yet their meaning was clear. He acknowledged the rumors, yet neither faltered nor yielded to them. Ilara's breath caught, her pulse quickening as she anticipated the measure of his next declaration. She had expected caution, perhaps a polite deflection, yet what came instead surprised her entirely. "I will not countenance such insinuations," Alastair continued, his gaze unwavering, scanning the hall with the quiet authority that had earned him both respect and fear. "Your character, and that of your child, is beyond the reach of idle whispers. Should anyone question the propriety of your presence here, they shall find me in disagreement." The hall, momentarily hushed, seemed to lean in closer, the chandeliers casting fractured light across polished floors as guests processed the magnitude of his pronouncement. Ilara felt a tremor of gratitude and awe, the weight of his defense almost tangible, as if it were a shield against every judgment she had ever endured. A delicate silence followed, broken only by the faint clink of a glass from a distant corner. The murmurs that had followed her into the hall were temporarily stilled, replaced by a palpable tension that vibrated through the gathered company. Eyes lingered, some in admiration, some in envy, all noting the courage it took for a duke of such stature to challenge society's unspoken rules in defense of a widow and her child. Ilara's heart pounded within her chest, both with the fear of exposure and the quiet thrill of being recognized for her unyielding dignity. The duke gestured for her to step slightly aside, leading her toward a secluded alcove beneath a velvet drapery, where the light softened and the whispers of the hall could not reach them. "I do not seek to elevate myself at your expense," he said, voice lowered to a private cadence, "but to ensure that virtue, when evident, is neither obscured nor diminished by the cowardice of idle speculation. Your presence here is not merely tolerated, it is esteemed." Ilara's eyes met his, and for the first time in months, she felt the suffocating weight of isolation ease, replaced by the fragile warmth of connection. Thomas tugged gently at her sleeve, his small voice barely audible. "Mama, is it all right?" Ilara knelt slightly, lifting her eyes to meet his. "Yes, my dear. It is more than all right. It is hope," she murmured, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Alistair watched this tender exchange, the curve of her lips as she spoke to her son, the quiet authority in her manner, and he felt a surge of something he had long considered lost, admiration, tempered by affection, rooted in respect and longing. The Duke's hand brushed lightly against hers, a touch deliberate yet gentle, acknowledging both the proximity and the burgeoning intimacy between them. "Madam," he said softly, "it has long been my belief that grief isolates, yet today, I have witnessed courage that transcends sorrow. I am compelled to ask, will you allow me and your son to continue in this companionship without fear or restraint?" His words, elegant yet profoundly honest, resonated in a space that had so often been governed by constraint and duty rather than heart. Ilara felt the fragile lines of her own fear tremble, her pulse quicken, and the stirrings of desire mingle with the caution born of experience. I do not know what to say, Your Grace," she admitted, voice trembling yet firm. "Society is unforgiving, and I fear the consequences of my choice. And yet, there is an honesty here, a quiet certainty that I cannot ignore. I will trust you." The words, hesitant yet resolute, marked a turning point. In their utterance, the invisible chains of judgment loosened, replaced by the tenuous promise of mutual understanding and unspoken possibility. Alistair inclined his head slightly, the faintest smile tracing his lips. "Then we shall proceed, cautiously yet openly, mindful of both our hearts and the world's gaze. Let neither rumor nor speculation dictate the truth we now choose to embrace." The subtle dignity in his tone reinforced the seriousness of his pledge, yet within it lay the spark of vulnerability that mirrored her own. Together, they stepped back into the hall, shoulders squared, faces composed, yet beneath their carefully measured exteriors lay the burgeoning awareness of a bond that neither society nor circumstance could fully suppress. The whispers resumed, inevitably, as the pair moved among the guests, yet Alistair's presence rendered them impotent. Eyes that had sought to deride or undermine now watched in awe, curiosity tempered by respect. Ilara, feeling the solidity of his support, allowed herself to relax in measured increments, each step a reclamation of her dignity, each glance exchanged with the Duke a silent affirmation of mutual courage and connection. By the time the evening drew toward its quieter hours, the hall seemed to settle, the tension replaced by a fragile equilibrium. The Duke and Ilara found themselves at the edge of a balcony, the rain having ceased, leaving the gardens glistening under the soft light of lanterns. Thomas leaned against the balustrade, his small hand in hers, and for a fleeting moment, the world beyond the estate felt distant, insignificant compared to the clarity of heart and purpose they shared. Alistair's gaze swept the horizon, then returned to hers, the weight of unspoken declarations heavy in the cool night air. "The world may judge, madam," he murmured, voice low and deliberate, "yet there is a courage in love that defies scrutiny. I am prepared to face both consequence and expectation for the sake of what is true." Ilara's breath caught at the intensity of the admission, a current of warmth and fear intertwining in her chest. She nodded, her eyes reflecting both hope and apprehension, recognizing that their union, of hearts, if not yet formally of social standing, would demand strength, patience, and unwavering resolve. And as the lanterns cast trembling reflections across the wet stone floor, a carriage approached the estate gates, its lamps cutting swaths of gold through the night. The messenger it carried bore news neither could yet anticipate, a summons that promised to challenge the fragile balance they had established and to test the courage and honesty that now bound them together. The Duke's hand lingered briefly in hers, a silent vow of protection, while Alara's grip tightened on Thomas's, preparing her for the unforeseen turn awaiting beyond the doors of Hawthorne Court. The night had deepened into velvet darkness, draping Hawthorne Court in a hush that seemed heavier than any day's scrutiny. Lanterns cast trembling pools of amber light across cobblestones slick with the evening rain, and the scent of wet wisteria and roses mingled with the faint smoke of hearth fires burning behind tall windows. Inside the estate, a tense quiet had settled, interrupted only by the soft rustle of skirts and the occasional murmur of concerned servants. Thomas had fallen ill unexpectedly, a sudden fever flaring and leaving him pale and fragile in his mother's arms. Alara's heart raced, each beat a drum of fear, as she moved swiftly through the hallways toward the Duke's private chambers, clutching the child close against her chest. Alastair had already been there, seated beside the bed, his hand pressed lightly against Thomas's small wrist, eyes dark with worry yet steady with determination. Candlelight danced across his features, revealing the shadows of sleepless nights, the faint lines carved by grief, and the intensity of care that softened even his usually commanding demeanor. When Alara entered, their eyes met briefly, and a wordless understanding passed between them. He had anticipated her arrival, yet he did not offer apologies or excuses, only a quiet assurance that she was not alone in this trial. "Is he stable?" she asked, her voice trembling, betraying both exhaustion and dread. Alastair's hand tightened around hers, not in restraint but in solidarity. "For now," he said softly, "yet the night is long. We must remain vigilant, and we must remain together." The words, simple yet profoundly intimate, carried a weight that neither ceremony nor etiquette could replicate. In that moment, the barriers imposed by society, the whispers of gossip, the judgments of peers, all seemed insignificant compared to the fragile lives and tender hearts gathered in this quiet chamber. The hours stretched, each one marked by the soft ticking of the clock and the subtle shifting of candlelight. Alara never left the bedside, her hand resting lightly upon Thomas's fevered brow, while Alastair remained beside her, offering water, comfort, and the steady warmth of presence. Their hands occasionally brushed, lingering with unspoken acknowledgment of shared vulnerability and growing attachment. Every small gesture, every quiet glance, reinforced the truth neither could yet fully articulate, that grief, courage, and kindness had woven them together in a tapestry stronger than any societal convention. As the fever finally began to ebb, leaving Thomas resting in a deep, exhausted slumber, the chamber seemed to exhale, the tension of the night slowly giving way to relief. Alara sank into the chair beside the bed, her body trembling from hours of fear and anticipation, and Alastair lowered himself opposite her, the candlelight catching the intensity of his gaze. For the first time, words felt possible where silence had reigned. "You have endured much," he murmured, voice low, intimate, yet formal in its resonance. "And yet, through fear and fatigue, you have not wavered in your courage. I cannot find words sufficient to convey what that means to me." Alara's lips parted, and for a heartbeat, no sound emerged, only the mutual recognition of the emotions that had long simmered beneath restraint. I have known fear," she admitted, voice soft yet unwavering. "Yet in your presence, your grace, I have also known trust. I have come to see that courage is not absence of fear, but the willingness to endure it for those one loves." The words, carefully measured yet filled with raw sincerity, hovered in the warm candlelight, bridging the distance that had lingered between them for months. Alastair leaned slightly forward, his dark eyes reflecting both longing and reverence. "Then permit me, Madam Whitcomb, to speak a truth long withheld, a truth I have feared to voice for the very reason you have articulated so clearly. I have lived in the shadow of grief, believing that my heart could offer no tenderness, that the loss I bore was permanent and insurmountable. Yet you, together with your son, have illuminated a path I thought forever closed. You have restored to me what I believed irretrievably lost, the capacity to hope, to care, to love." His words, deliberate and unflinching, struck a chord that resonated deep within her, a current of both fear and exhilaration intertwining. Alara's breath caught, her hand brushing instinctively against his. "And I have feared for you, your grace. I have seen your solitude, known your grief, and yet I have come to understand that companionship need not diminish it, but may transform it. I cannot deny what I feel, though society's eyes will never forgive it." Her voice, steady yet trembling with the weight of confession, carried a depth of emotion that matched his own. For a fleeting moment, the chamber held only the warmth of shared vulnerability, the palpable electricity of hearts aligning in unspoken harmony. Alistair's hand found hers, firm yet gentle, a bridge between restraint and surrender. "Then let us face the world, not as isolated souls, but united by choice, by courage, and by the honesty we now share. Let whispers and judgment fall where they may, for the truth between us requires no validation." The intensity of his gaze, combined with the unwavering sincerity in his tone, left no space for doubt. Elara felt the fragile walls around her heart give way, her pulse quickening with the weight and exhilaration of possibility. Thomas stirred, lifting his small head and gazing between them, eyes wide and trusting. "Mama, he's not angry at me, is he?" he asked softly. Elara smiled, brushing a strand of damp hair from his forehead. "No, my dear. He could never be angry at you," she whispered, voice warm yet firm, embodying both protection and gentle authority. Alistair bent slightly, lifting Thomas into his arms for a moment, offering a smile that blended paternal affection and quiet admiration. The child, sensing safety and acceptance, relaxed, nestling into the Duke's steady presence as though instinctively knowing the bond that had formed. The chamber, once tense and fraught with uncertainty, now resonated with the quiet harmony of mutual recognition and chosen connection. Lanterns flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls, while the scent of roses and candle wax mingled with a faint trace of rain-soaked stone. Outside, the world awaited, rife with judgment, rumor, and expectation, yet within these walls, a new order had emerged, one defined not by convention, but by courage, love, and the deliberate choice to embrace truth. Alistair finally released Thomas, who crawled into his mother's lap, and turned to Elara fully, his eyes dark and unwavering. "I cannot promise that the path ahead will be free of challenge, yet I can promise my unwavering devotion, my protection, and my resolve. Whatever society dictates, whatever obstacles rise, I choose you, and Thomas, as the heart of my life." The magnitude of the declaration, delivered with both gravity and tenderness, reverberated through the chamber like a bell tolling a single resonant truth. Elara's chest tightened, tears threatening to spill, as she absorbed the weight and clarity of the moment. Her own voice, when it emerged, was a whisper yet carried the force of certainty. "Then I choose you, Your Grace. And I choose to stand beside you, come what may. For fear and hope are no longer enemies, but companions on this path we now walk together." Their hands intertwined, a union of intent, courage, and burgeoning love, as Thomas watched with a mixture of awe and quiet pride, understanding in his own childlike way that something profound had shifted in the world around him. Beyond the chamber walls, the estate lay in darkness, awaiting the sunrise that would bring both challenge and promise. Lanterns flickered, shadows danced, and the gentle rustle of curtains whispered of secrets kept and truths unveiled. In that quiet night, within the intimate circle of candlelight and whispered breaths, two souls had made their choice, a decision that would defy expectation, confront scandal, and endure whatever trials awaited. The night held its breath, and in that suspended moment, the fragile, luminous promise of love and courage shone brighter than any judgment cast by the world beyond.